we free driving forces. Everybody's done this by now, right? The push your hands together. Everybody had a chance to do that somewhere? Okay. So every time, Kurt Lewin's name that I really quite like was quasi-stationary equilibrium. Okay. That the balance between the driving forces and the restraining forces is in a quasi-stationary equilibrium. And at any point in time, if you collect the force field of what a group is doing, you get the quasi-stationary equilibrium or balance point. And if you want to help a group change, if you try to do it by increasing drive, you put the system under stress and pressure. If instead you help a system change by weakening restraining forces, the system's own drive gets free to carry it forward. And that is a really big idea, and it is behind everything in SCT, is that what we're doing is weakening restraining forces instead of trying to increase drive. And for any of you who are organizational consultants, you know, if you go into a system, and it's the same with clinical practice, and you try to get the system to change, and the change energy is from the consultant or from the therapist, then the person is not the person or the system you're consulting with is not changing through their own drive. And then guess what happens when you leave? Goes back to the way it was. You know, we think of it as the Sisyphus system. When we get caught in the role of pushing a system to change, we are rolling the rock up the hill. And as soon as we're not there rolling it up the hill, it's going to roll back down. So what we're doing in SCT the whole time is learning to, instead of trying to increase drive, to simply weaken restraints so the system's own driving forces will carry it forward. Now, that idea underlies the whole idea of phases of development, because what Yvonne then did was she took the basic phases, which we call the authority phase, the intimacy phase, although in a work group we would call it the collaboration phase, and the integration phase or the work phase. And what she identified was that in each phase there will be an output goal, which we call the developmental goal, which really relates to surviving, developing, and transforming as a living human system. And there will be a predictable set in each phase of driving forces and restraining forces in relationship to moving towards that developmental goal. And that if one has correctly identified the phase of a system, then the map of phases of development really guides your interventions. Because what you're doing is you are weakening the restraining forces that are relevant to that phase to move the system toward its goal. And inside the authority phase, we really identify four major subphases. And the first of these is the flight subphase. The second is the fight subphase, and you hear some of Bion's influence in here. And the next subphase is the rolls and roll lock subphase, and the next subphase is the barometric event, or the crisis of hatred. Now, what's nice about this is if you're thinking force field, you will have at each boundary of subphase, you'll have the driving and restraining forces. So you'll really have a force field at each phase boundary. And each phase and subphase, as the group moves from one phase to the next, there is really a transformation in the group. And those of you who were at the Savvy and Communication Patterns yesterday, the transformation includes the communication pattern is different in each phase. So the way that energy and information gets discriminated and integrated, the kinds of subgroups that emerge, and the communication pattern itself will be different in each subphase. And let me just make another picture of this a little bit bigger. If we take the flight subphase with its driving and restraining forces and its goal, and the outcome goal of the flight subphase is really to develop a reality testing culture. What we are going to be doing the whole way through is weakening restraining forces bit by bit until enough of the driving energy is freed that the system meets its developmental goal, at which point the system transforms from the flight phase to the fight phase. And then we have the predictable force field in the fight phase. Now, does that make sense to everybody?
When you get in a group together and there's some people that are really fighters and others that are... Okay, so you're saying going from one to the next. You can get a group where these other people just want complete control immediately and the other people...
So how would we phrase that in SCT language, Kim? What would you say?
Well, there would be two phases going on.
Well, you've got two subgroups. Yes. And one of the other models that we use to look at that is if you think of the bell-shaped curve and the predominant phase of development where I think, 68% of the group's behavior will be, let's say, in flight. The leading edge subgroup might be in fight. So in effect, in the group's life, we've got two subgroups. And one is at the leading edge of the group's work. One is more of the bulk of where the group's energy is. And then as the group continues to develop, the fight becomes the dominant group phase. And as the fight is the dominant group phase, the flight is the trailing edge of the group's phase.
It's just a matter of more members of...
It's more energy. Yeah, it's more energy. And, you know, the other thing that's very interesting is when a group is in transition like that between the two subphases, there will always be a little more turbulence in the group. Whenever a system's in transition, there's a little more turbulence. So when a system's solidly in fight, in a way, it's a little more settled. When it's in that transition with one foot in fight and one foot in flight, it will be a little bit more turbulent system. The other thing is you see systems balancing themselves. So there'll be the leading edge of a group that starts to go into fight. And then there'll be the flight system that comes up and has all the anxiety about the fight, which will be the flight system, which will balance the pace of the group so that the development happens at a pace that the system as a whole can integrate. Okay? So, this model, everybody on board with this so far? So let me go back to this picture. It's not a linear model, actually. We present it as if it's linear. It's far from linear. And groups do all kinds of things. You'll see a group jumpstart itself ahead of where it is. And then the amount of work it can do in that phase that's ahead of where it is limited. And then it goes back and does the groundwork that enables it to go further. So, you know, a good common example is often a group will try to work in intimacy before it can. And then its capacity, how far it can go in intimacy, is really very limited. And then it ends up going back and doing all the authority work that lays the foundation for a much deeper intimacy exploration. The other thing is groups recycle through their phases all the time. And once a group reaches the work phase, it then revisits all kinds of phase issues from a work perspective, where it's really exploring the conflicts and dynamics in the phase. Because each phase will have its own predictable conflicts.